Chapter 4 of Farewell Nikola by Guy Boothby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. After our excursion through Venice with Nikola by night, an interval of a week elapsed before we saw anything of him. During that time matters, so far as our party was concerned, progressed with the smoothness of a well-regulated clock. In my own mind I had not the shadow of a doubt that Glenbarth was head over ears in love with Gertrude Trevor. He followed her about wherever she went, seemed never to tire of paying her attention, and whenever we were alone together endeavoured to inveigle me into a discussion of her merits. That she had faults, nothing would convince him. Whether she reciprocated his good feeling was a matter which, to my mind, there existed a considerable amount of doubt. Women are proverbially more secretive in these affairs than men, and if Miss Trevor entertained a warmer feeling than friendship for the young Duke, she certainly managed to conceal it admirably. More than once, I believe, my wife endeavoured to sound her upon the subject. She had to confess herself beaten, however. Miss Trevor liked the Duke of Glenbarth very much. She was quite agreed that he had not an atom of conceit in his constitution. He gave himself no airs. Moreover, she was prepared to meet my wife halfway, and to say she thought it a pity he did not marry. No, she had never heard there was an American millionaire girl, extremely beautiful and accomplished beyond the average, who was pining to throw her millions and herself at his feet. And then, added my wife, in a tone that seemed to suggest that she considered it my fault that the matter had not been brought to a successful conclusion long since, what do you think she said? Why on earth doesn't she marry this American? So many men of title do nowadays. What do you think of that? I can tell you, Dick, I could have shaken her. My dear little woman, I said in reply, will nothing convince you that you are playing with fire? If you are not very careful, you will burn your fingers. Gertrude is almost as clever as you are. She sees that you are trying to pump her, and very naturally declines to be pumped. You would feel as she does were you in her position. I do not know why you should say I am trying to pump her, she answered with considerable dignity. I consider it a very uncalled for expression. Well, my dear, I answered, if you are going to attempt to improve your position by splitting straws, then I must stop. The episode I have just described had taken place after I had retired for the night, and at a time when I am far from being at my best. My wife, on the other hand, as I have repeatedly noticed, is invariably wide awake at that hour. Moreover, she has established a belief that it would be an impossibility for her to obtain any rest until she has cleared up all matters of mystery that may have attracted her attention during the day. I generally fall asleep before she is halfway through, and for this reason I am told that I lack interest in what most nearly concerns our welfare. One would at least imagine that you could remain awake to discuss events of so much importance to us and to those about us, I have known her say. I have observed that you can talk about horses, hunting and shooting with your bachelor friends until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning without falling asleep. But when your wife is anxious to ask your opinion about something that does not concern your amusements, then you must needs go to sleep. My dear, I replied, when all is said and done we are but human. You know as well as I do that if a man were to come to me when I had settled down for the night, and were to tell me that he knew where to lay his hand upon the finest horse in England, and where he could put me on to 10 coveys of partridges within a couple of 100 yards of my own door, that he could even tell me the winner of the Derby, I should answer him as I am now answering you. And your reply would be? I am afraid the pains I had been at to illustrate my own argument must have proved too much for me, for I was informed in the morning that I had talked a vast amount of nonsense about seeing Nikola concerning a new pigeon trap, and had then resigned myself to the arms of Morpheus. If there should be any husbands whose experience had run on similar lines, I should be glad to hear from them. But to return to my story. One evening, exactly a week after Glenbarth's arrival in Venice, I was dressing for dinner when a letter was brought to me. Much to my surprise, I found it was from Nikola, and in it he inquired whether it would be possible for me to spare the time to come and see him that evening. It appeared that he was anxious to discuss a certain important matter with me. I noticed, however, that he did not mention what the matter was. In a postscript he asked me, as a favour to himself, to come alone. Having read the letter, I stood for a few moments with it in my hand, wondering what I should do. I was not at all anxious to go out that evening. On the other hand, I had a strange craving to see Nikola once more. The suggestion that he desired to consult me upon a matter of importance flattered my vanity, particularly as of such a nature that he did not desire the presence of a third person. Yes, I thought, after all I will go. Accordingly, I wrote him a note saying that if the hour would suit him, I hoped to be with him at 9:30. Then I continued my dressing and presently went down to dinner. During the progress of the meal I mentioned the fact that I had received the letter in question, and asked my friends if they would excuse me if I went round in the course of the evening to find out what it was that Nikola had to say to me. Perhaps by virtue of my early training, perhaps by a natural instinct, I am a keen observer of trifles. On this occasion I noticed that from the moment I mentioned the fact of my having received a letter from Nikola, Miss Trevor ate scarcely any more dinner. Upon my mentioning his name, she had looked at me with a startled expression upon her face. She said nothing, however, but I observed that her left hand, which she had a trick of keeping below the table as much as possible, was for some moments busily engaged in picking pieces from the roll beside her plate. For some reason she had grown nervous again, but why she should have done so passes my comprehension. When the ladies had retired, and we were sitting together over our wine, Glenbarth returned to the subject of my visit that evening. "By Jove, my dear fellow," he said, "I don't envy you your excursion to that house. Don't you feel a bit nervous about it yourself?" I shook my head. "Why should I?" asked. "If the truth must be told, I am a good deal more afraid of Nikola than I am of his house. I don't fancy on the present occasion, however, that I have any reason to dread either." "Well," said the Duke with a laugh, "if you are not at home by breakfast time to morrow morning, I shall bring the police round and look down that trap door. You'll take a revolver with you, of course." "I should do nothing of the kind," I replied. "Quite able to take care of myself without having recourse to firearms." Nevertheless, when I went up to my room to change my coat prior to leaving the house, I took a small revolver from my dressing case and weighed it in my hand. Shall I take it or shall I not, was the question I asked myself. Eventually I shook my head and replaced it in its hiding place. Then, switching off the electric light, I made for the door, only to return, reopen the dressing case and take out the revolver. Without further argument I slipped it into the pocket of my coat and then left the room. A quarter of an hour later my gondolier had turned into the Rio del Consiglio and was approaching the Palace Revecce. The house was in deep shadow and looked very dark and lonesome. The gondolier seemed to be of the same opinion, for he was anxious to set me down, to collect his fare, and to get away again as soon as possible. Standing in the porch, I rang the great bell which Nikola had pointed out to me, and which we had not observed on the morning of our first visit. It clanged and echoed somewhere in the rearmost portion of the house, intensifying the loneliness of the situation and adding a new element of mystery to that abominable dwelling. In spite of my boast to Glenbarth, I was not altogether at my ease. It was one thing to pretend that I had no objection to the place when I was seated in a well-lighted room, with a glass of port in my hand and a stalwart friend opposite. It was quite another, however, to be standing in the dark at that ancient portal, with the black water of the canal at my feet, and the anticipation of that sombre room ahead. Then I heard the sound of footsteps crossing the courtyard, and a moment later Nikola himself stood before me and invited me to enter. A solitary lamp had been placed upon the coping of the wall, and its fitful light illuminated the courtyard, throwing long shadows across the pavement, and making it look even drearier and more unwholesome than when I had last seen it. After we had shaken hands, we made our way in silence up the great staircase, our steps echoing along the stone corridors with startling reverberations. How thankful I was at last to reach the well-lit room, despite the story Nikola had told us about it. I must leave you to imagine. "Please sit down," said Nikola, pushing a chair forward for my occupation. "It is exceedingly kind of you to have complied with my request. I trust Lady Hatteras and Miss Trevor are well." "Thank you, they are both well," I replied. "They both beg to be remembered to you." Nikola bowed his thanks, and then, when he had placed a box of excellent cigars at my elbow, prepared and lighted a cigarette for himself. All this time I was occupying myself wondering why he had asked me to come to him that evening, and what the upshot of the interview was to be. Knowing him as I did, I was aware that his actions were never motiveless. Everything he did was to be accounted for by some very good reason. After he had tendered his thanks to me for coming to see him, he was silent for some minutes, for so long indeed that I began to wonder whether he had forgotten my presence. In order to attract his attention, I commented upon the fact that we had not seen him for more than a week. "I have been away," he answered, with what was plainly an attempt to pull himself together. "Business of a most important nature called me to the south of Italy, to Naples in fact, and I only returned this morning." Once more he was silent. Then, leaning towards me, and speaking with even greater impressiveness than he had yet done, he continued, "Hatteras, I am going to ask you a question, and then, with your permission, should like to tell you a story." Not knowing what else to do, I simply bowed. I was more than ever convinced that Nikola was going to make use of me. "Have you ever wondered," he began, still looking at me straight in the face and speaking with great earnestness, "what it was first made me the man I am?" I replied to the effect that I had often wondered, but naturally had never been able to come to a satisfactory conclusion. "Some day you shall know the history of my life," he answered, "but not just yet. There is much to be done before then, and now I am going to give you the story I promised you. You will see why I have told it to you when I have finished." He rose from his chair and began to pace the room. I had never seen Nikola so agitated before. When he turned and faced me again, his eyes shone like diamonds. His whole body quivered with suppressed excitement. "Hatteras," he went on, when he had somewhat mastered his emotion, "I doubt very much if ever in this world's history there has been a man who has suffered more than I have done. As I said just now, the whole story I cannot tell you at present. Some day it will come in its proper place, and you will know everything. In the meantime—" He paused for a few moments, and then continued abruptly, "The story concerns a woman, a native of this city, the last of an impoverished but ancient family. She married a man many years her senior, whom she did not love. When they had been married just over 4 years, her husband died, leaving her with one child to fight the battles of the world alone. The boy was nearly 3 years old, sturdy, clever little urchin, who up to that time had never known the meaning of the word trouble. Then there came to Venice a man, a Spaniard, handsome as a serpent and as cruel. After a while he made the woman believe that he loved her. She returned his affection, and in due time they were married. A month later he was appointed governor of one of the Spanish islands off the American coast, a post he had long been eager to obtain. When he departed to take up his position, it was arranged that as soon as all was prepared, the woman and her child should follow him. They did so, and at length reached the island and took up their abode, not at the palace, as the woman had expected, but in the native city. For the governor feared, or pretended to fear, that as his marriage had not been made public at first, it might compromise his position. The woman, however, who loved him was content, for her one thought was to promote his happiness. At first the man made believe to be overjoyed at having her with him once again, and then, little by little, he showed that he was tired of her. Another woman had attracted his fancy, and he had transferred his affections to her. The other heard of it, her southern blood was roused, for though she had been poor, she was, as I have said, the descendant of one of the oldest Venetian families. As his wife she endeavoured to defend herself, and then came the crushing blow, delivered with all the brutality of a savage nature. "You are not my wife," he said. "I already had a wife living when I married you." She left him without another word and went away to hide her shame. 6 months later the fever took her and she died. Thus the boy was left at 5 years old without a friend or protector in the world. Happily, however, a humble couple took compassion on him, and after a time determined to bring him up as their own. The old man was a great scholar, and had devoted all his life to the exhaustive study of the occult sciences. To educate the boy when he grew old enough to understand was his one delight. He was never weary of teaching him, nor did the boy ever tire of learning. It was a mutual labour of love. 7 years later saw both the lad's benefactors at rest in the little churchyard beneath the palms, and the boy himself homeless once more. But he was not destined to remain so for very long. The priest who had buried his adopted parents spoke to the governor, little dreaming what he was doing, of the boy's pitiable condition. It was as if the devil had prompted him, for the Spaniard was anxious to find a playfellow for his son, a lad 2 years the other's junior. It struck him that the waif would fill the position admirably. He was accordingly deported to the palace, to enter upon the most miserable period of his life. His likeness to his mother was unmistakable, and when he noticed it, the governor, who had learned the secret, hated him for it, as only those hate who are conscious of their wrongdoing. From that moment his cruelty knew no bounds. The boy was powerless to defend himself. All that he could do was loathe his oppressor with all the intensity of his fiery nature, and to pray that the day might come when he should be able to repay. To his own son the governor was passionately attached. In his eyes the latter could do no wrong. For any of his misdeeds it was the stranger who bore the punishment. On the least excuse he was stripped and beaten like a slave. The governor's son, knowing his power and the other's inordinate sensitiveness, derived his chief pleasure in inventing new cruelties for him. To describe all that followed would be impossible. When nothing else would rouse him, it was easy to bring him to an ungovernable pitch of fury by insulting his mother's name, with whose history the servants had by this time made their master's son acquainted. Once driven into a paroxysm of fury by the other's insults, the lad picked up a knife and rushed at his tormentor with the intention of stabbing him. His attempt, however, failed, and the boy, foaming at the mouth, was carried before the governor. I will spare you a description of the punishment that was meted out for his offence. Let it suffice that there are times, even now, when the mere thought of it is sufficient to bring... But there, why should I continue in this strain? All that I am telling you happened many years ago, but the memory remains clear and distinct, while the desire for vengeance is as keen as if it had happened but yesterday. What is more, the end is coming as surely as the lad once hoped and prophesied it would. Nikola paused for a moment and sank into his chair. I have never seen him so affected. His face was deathly pale, while his eyes blazed like living coals. What became of the boy at last? I inquired, knowing all the while he had been speaking of himself. He escaped from the island and went out into the world. The governor is dead. He has gone to meet the woman or women he so cruelly wronged. His son has climbed the ladder of fame, but he has never lost, as his record shows, the cruel heart he possessed as a boy. Do you remember the story of the revolution in the Republic of Equinata? I shook my head. The republics of South America indulge so constantly in their little amusements that it is difficult for an outsider to remember every particular one, I answered. Well, let me tell you about it. When the Republic of Equinata suffered from its first revolution, this man was its president. But for his tyranny and injustice it would not have taken place. He it was who, finding that the rebellion was spreading, captured a certain town and bade the eldest son of each of the influential families wait upon him at his headquarters on the morning following its capitulation. His excuse was that he desired them as hostages for their parents' good behaviour. As it was, however, to wreak his vengeance upon the city which had opposed him, instead of siding with him, he placed them against a wall and shot them down by the half-dozen. But he was not destined to succeed. Gradually he was driven back upon his capital, his troops deserting day by day. Then one night he boarded a ship that was waiting for him in the harbour, and from that moment Equinata saw him no more. It was not until some days afterwards that it was discovered that he had dispatched vast sums of money, which he had misappropriated, out of the country ahead of him. Where he is now hiding I am the only man who knows. I have tracked him to his lair, and I am waiting for the moment to arrive when the innocent blood that has so long cried to heaven will be avenged. Let him look to himself when that day arrives, for as there is a God above us, he will be punished as a man was never punished before. The expression upon his face as he said this was little short of devilish. The ghastly pallor of his skin, the dark glittering eyes, and his jet black hair made up a picture that will never fade from my memory. God help his enemy if they should meet, I said to myself. Then his mood suddenly changed. He was once more the quiet, suave Nikola to whom I had become accustomed. Every sign of passion had vanished from his face. A transformation more complete could scarcely have been imagined. "My dear fellow," he said, without a trace of emotion in his voice, "you must really forgive me for having bored you with my long story. I cannot think what made me do so, unless it is that I have been brooding over it all day, and felt the need of a confidant. You will make an allowance for me, will you not?" "Most willingly," I answered. "If the story you have told me concerns yourself, you have my most heartfelt sympathy. You have suffered indeed." He stopped for a moment in his restless walk up and down the room, and eyed me carefully, as if he were trying to read my thoughts. "Suffered," he said at last, and then paused. "Yes, I have suffered, but others have suffered more. But do not let us talk of it. I was foolish to have touched upon it, for I know by experience the effect it produces upon me." As he spoke he crossed to the window, which he threw open. It was a glorious night, and the sound of women's voices singing reached us from the Grand Canal. On the other side of the watery highway the houses looked strangely mysterious in the weird light. At that moment I felt more drawn towards Nikola than I had ever done before. The man's loneliness, his sufferings, had a note of singular pathos for me. I forgot the injuries it had done me, and before I knew what I was doing I had placed my hand upon his shoulder. "Nikola," I said, "if I were to try, I could not make you understand how truly sorry I am for you. The life you lead is so unlike that of any other man. You see only the worst of human nature. Why not leave this terrible gloom, give up these experiments upon which you are always engaged, and live only in the pure air of the commonplace everyday world? Your very surroundings, this house for instance, are not like those of other men. Believe me, there are other things worth living for besides the science which binds you in its chains. If you could learn to love a good woman—" "My dear Hatteras," he put in more softly than I had ever heard him speak, "woman's love is not for me. As you say, I am lonely in the world, God knows how lonely, yet lonely I must be content to remain." Then, leaning his hands upon the window sill, he looked out upon the silent night, and I heard him mutter to himself, "Yes, lonely to the end." After that he closed the window abruptly, and turning to me, asked how long we contemplated remaining in Venice. "I cannot say," I answered. "The change is doing my wife so much good that I am anxious to prolong our stay. At first we thought of going to the south of France, but that idea has been abandoned, and we may be here another month." "A month," he said to himself, as if he were reflecting upon something. Then he added somewhat inconsequently, "You should be able to see a great deal of Venice in a month." "And how long will you be here?" I asked. He shook his head. "That's impossible to say," he answered. "I never know my own mind for 2 days together. I may be here another week, or I may be here a year. Somehow I have a conviction, I cannot say why, that this will prove to be my last visit to Venice. I should be sorry never to see it again. Yet what must be, must. Destiny will have its way, whatever we may say or do to the contrary." At that moment there was a sound of a bell clanging in the courtyard below. At such an hour it had an awe-inspiring sound, and I know that I shuddered as I heard it. "Who can it be?" said Nikola, turning towards the door. "This is somewhat late for calling hours. Will you excuse me if I go down and find out the meaning of it?" "Do so by all means," I answered. "I think I must be going also. It is getting late." "No, no," he said. "Stay a little longer. If it is as I suspect, I fancy I shall be able to show you something that may interest you. Endeavour to make yourself comfortable until I return. I shall not be away many minutes." So saying he left me, closing the door behind him. When I was alone I lit a cigar and strolled to the window, which I opened. My worst enemy could not call me a coward, but I must confess that I derived no pleasure from being in that room alone. The memory of what lay under that oriental rug was vividly impressed upon my memory. In my mind I could smell the vaults below, and it would have required only a very small stretch of the imagination to have fancied I could hear the groans of the dying man proceeding from it. Then a feeling of curiosity came over me to see who Nikola's visitor was. By leaning well out of the window I could look down on the great door below. At the foot of the steps a gondola was drawn up, but I was unable to see whether there was anyone in it or not. Who was Nikola's mysterious caller, and what made him come at such an hour? Knowing the superstitious horror in which the house was held by the populace of Venice, I felt that whoever he was, he must have had an imperative reason for his visit. I was still turning the subject over in my mind when the door opened and Nikola entered, followed by two men. One was tall and swarthy, wore a short black beard, had a crafty expression upon his face. The other was about middle height, very broad, and was the possessor of a bullet head covered with close-cropped hair. Both were of the lower class, and their nationality was unmistakable. Turning to me, Nikola said in English, "It is as I expected. Now, if you care to study character, here is your opportunity. The taller man is a police agent, the other the chief of a notorious secret society. I should first explain that within the last 2 or 3 days I have been helping a young Italian of rather advanced views, not to put too fine a point upon it, to leave the country for America. This dog has dared to try and upset my plans. Immediately I heard of it I sent word to him by means of our friend here that he was to present himself here before 12 o'clock tonight without fail. From his action it would appear he is more frightened of me than he is of the secret society. That is as it should be, for I intend to teach him a little lesson which will prevent him from interfering with my plans in the future. You were talking of my science just now, and advising me to abandon it. Could the life you offer me give me the power I possess now? Could the respectability of Clapham recompense me for the knowledge with which the East can furnish me?" Then turning to the police agent, he addressed him in Italian, speaking so fast that it was impossible for me to follow him. From what little I could make out, however, I gathered that he was rating him for daring to interfere with his concerns. When at the end of 3 or 4 minutes he paused and spoke more slowly, this was the gist of his speech. "You know me and the power I control. You are aware that those who thwart me or who interfere with me and my concerns do so at their own risk. Since no harm has come of it, thanks to certain good friends, I will forgive on this occasion, but let it happen again, and this is what your end will be." As he spoke he took from his pocket a small glass bottle with a gold top, not unlike a vinaigrette, and emptied some of the white powder it contained into the palm of his hand. Turning down the lamp he dropped this into the chimney. A green flame shot up for a moment, which was succeeded by a cloud of perfumed smoke that filled the room so completely that for a moment it was impossible for us to see each other. Presently a picture shaped itself in the cloud and held my attention spellbound. Little by little it developed until I was able to make out a room, or rather I should say a vault, in which upwards of a dozen men were seated at a long table. They were all masked, and without exception were clad in long monkish robes with cowls of black cloth. Presently a sign was made by the man at the head of the table. An individual with a venerable grey beard and 2 more black figures entered, who led a man between them. Their prisoner was none other than the police agent whom Nikola had warned. He looked thinner, however, and was evidently much frightened by his position. Once more the man at the head of the table raised his hand, and there entered at the other side an old man with white hair and a long beard of the same colour. Unlike the others, he wore no cowl, nor was he masked. From his gestures I could see he was addressing those seated at the table, and as he pointed to the prisoner a look of undying hatred spread over his face. Then the man at the head of the table rose, and though I could hear nothing of what he said, I gathered that he was addressing his brethren concerning the case. When he had finished, and each of the assembly had voted by holding up his hand, he turned to the prisoner, and as he did so the scene vanished instantly and another took its place. It was a small room that I looked upon now, furnished only with a bed, a table and a chair. At the door was a man who had figured as a prisoner in the previous picture, but now sadly changed. He seemed to have shrunk to half his former size. His face was pinched by starvation. His eyes were sunken, but there was an even greater look of terror in them than had been there before. Opening the door of the room, he listened, and then shut and locked it again. It was as if he was afraid to go out, and yet knew that if he remained where he was, must perish of starvation. Gradually the room began to grow dark, and the terrified wretch paced up and down, listening at the door every now and then. Once more the picture vanished, as its companion had done, and a third took its place. This proved to be a narrow street sign by moonlight. On either side the houses towered upwards towards the sky, and since there was no one about, it was plain that the night was far advanced. Presently, creeping along in the shadow on the left-hand side, searching among the refuse and garbage of the street for food, came the man I had seen afraid to leave his attic. Times out of number he looked swiftly behind him, as if he thought it possible that he might be followed. He was but little more than halfway up the street, and was stooping to pick up something, when two dark figures emerged from a passage on the left and swiftly approached him. Before he had time to defend himself, they were upon him, and a moment later he was lying stretched out upon his back in the middle of the street, a dead man. The moon shone full down and clear upon his face, the memory of which makes me shudder even now. Then the picture faded away, and the room was light once more. Instinctively I looked at the police agent. His usually swarthy face was deathly pale, and from the great beads of perspiration that stood upon his forehead, I gathered that he had seen the picture too. "Now," said Nikola, addressing him, "you have seen what is in store for you if you persist in pitting yourself against me. You recognise that the grey-haired man who appealed to the council against you. Then rest assured of this: so surely as you continue your present conduct, so surely will the doom I have just revealed to you overtake you. Now go and remember what I have said." Turning to the smaller man, Nikola placed his hand in a kindly fashion upon his shoulder. "You have done well, Tomaso," he said. "I am pleased with you. Drop our friend here at the usual place, and see that someone keeps an eye on him. I don't think, however, he will dare to offend again." On hearing this, the two men left the room and descended to the courtyard together, and I could easily imagine with what delight one of them would leave the house. When they had gone, Nikola, who was standing at the window, turned to me, saying, "What do you think of my conjuring?" I knew not what answer to make that would satisfy him. The whole thing seemed so impossible that, had it not been for the pungent odour which still lingered in the room, I could have believed I had fallen asleep and dreamed it all. "You can give me no explanation, then," said Nikola, with one of his inscrutable smiles. "And yet, having accumulated this power, this knowledge, call it what you will, you would still bid me to give up science. Come, my friend, you have seen something of what I can do. Would you be brave enough to try, with my help, to look into what is called the Great Unknown, and see what the future has in store for you? I fancy it could be done. Are you to be tempted to see your own end?" "No, no," I cried. "I will have nothing to do with such an unholy thing. Good heavens, man, from that moment on life would be unendurable." "You think so, do you?" he said slowly, keeping his eye fixed on me. "And yet I have tried it myself." "My God, Nikola!" I answered in amazement, for I knew him well enough to feel sure that he was not talking idly. "You don't mean to tell me that you know what your own end is going to be?" "Exactly," he answered. "I've seen it all, and it's not pleasant. But I think I may say without vanity that it will be an end worthy of myself." "But now that you know it, can you not avert it?" "Nothing can be averted," he answered solemnly. "As I said before these men entered, what must be, must. What does Schiller say? Noch niemand entfloh dem verhängten Geschick. And you were brave enough to look. Does it require so much bravery, do you think? Believe me, there are things which require more." "What do you mean?" "Ah, I cannot tell you now," he answered, shaking his head. "Some day you will know." Then there was a silence for a few seconds, during which we both stood looking down at the moonlit water below. At last, having consulted my watch and seeing how late it was, I told him that it was time for me to bid him good night. "I am very grateful to you for coming, Hatteras," he said. "It has cheered me up. It does me good to see you. Through you I get a whiff of that other life of which you spoke a while back." I want to make you like me, and I fancy I am succeeding." Then we left the room together and went down the stairs to the courtyard below. Side by side we stood upon the steps waiting for a gondola to put in an appearance. It was some time before one came in sight, but when it did so I hailed it and then shook Nikola by the hand and bade him good night. "Good night," he answered. "Pray remember me kindly to Lady Hatteras and to Miss Trevor." The little pause before Miss Trevor's name caused me to look at him in some surprise. He noticed it and spoke at once. "You may think it strange of me to say so," he said, "but I cannot help feeling interested in that young lady. Impossible though it may seem, I have a well-founded conviction that in some way her star is destined to cross mine, and before very long. I have only seen her twice in my life in the flesh, but many years ago her presence on the earth was revealed to me, and I was warned that some day we should meet. What that meeting will mean to me is impossible to say, but in its own good time fate will doubtless tell me. And now once more, good night." "Good night," I answered mechanically, for I was too much surprised by his words to think what I was saying. Then I entered the gondola and bade the man take me back to my hotel. "Surely Nikola has taken leave of his senses," I said to myself as I was rowed along. Gertrude Trevor was the very last person in the world that I should have expected Nikola to make such a statement about. At this point, however, I remembered how curiously she had been affected by their first meeting, and my mind began to be troubled concerning her. "Let us hope and pray that Nikola doesn't take it into his head to imagine himself in love with her," I continued to myself. "If he were to do so, I scarcely know what the consequences would be." Then, with a touch of the absurd, I wondered what her father, the eminently respected Dean, would say to having Nikola for a son-in-law. By the time I had reached this point in my reverie, the gondola had drawn up at the steps of the hotel. My wife and Miss Trevor had gone to bed, but Glenbarth was sitting up for me. "Well, you've paid him a long visit in all conscience," he said a little reproachfully. Then he added with what was intended to be a touch of sarcasm, "I hope you have spent a pleasant evening." "I'm not quite so certain about that," I replied. "Indeed, then what have you discovered?" "One thing of importance," I answered, "that Nikola grows more and more inscrutable every day." Chapter 5. Of Farewell, Nikola, by Guy Boothby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. The more I thought upon my strange visit to the Palace Revecce that evening, the more puzzled I was by it. It had so many sides, and each so complex, that I scarcely knew which presented the most curious feature. What Nikola's real reason had been for inviting me to call upon him, and why he should have told me the story which I felt quite certain was that of his own life, was more than I could understand. Moreover, why, having told it me, he should have so suddenly requested me to think no more about it, only adding to my bewilderment the incident of the two men and the extraordinary conjuring trick, for conjuring trick it certainly was in the real meaning of the word he had shown us, did not help to elucidate matters. If the truth must be told, it rather added to the mystery than detracted from it. To sum it all up, I found that when I endeavoured to fit the pieces of the puzzle together, remembering also his strange remark concerning Miss Trevor, that I was far from coming to any conclusion as I had been at the beginning. "You can have no idea how nervous I have been on your account to-night," said my wife when I reached her room. After dinner the Duke gave us a description of Dr. Nikola's room and told us its history. When I thought of your being there alone with him, I must confess I felt almost inclined to send a message to you imploring you to come home. "That would have been a great mistake, my dear," I answered. "You would have offended Nikola, and we don't want to do that. I am sorry the Duke told you that terrible story. He should not have frightened you with it. What did Gertrude Trevor think of it?" "She did not say anything about it," my wife replied, "but I could see that she was as frightened as I was. I am quite sure you would not get either of us to go there. however pressing Dr. Nikola's invitation might be. Now tell me what he wanted to see you about. Felt lonely and wanted some society, I answered, having resolved that on no account would I tell her all the truth concerning my visit to the Palace Revicci. He also wanted me to witness something connected with the scheme he has originated for enabling people to get out of the country unobserved by the police. Before I left, he gave me a good example of the power he possessed. I then described to her the arrival of the two men and the lesson Nikola had read to the police agent. The portion dealing with the conjuring trick I omitted. No good could have accrued from frightening her, and I knew that the sort of description I should be able to give of it would not be sufficiently impressive to enable her to see it in the light I desired. In any other way it would have struck her as ridiculous. "The man grows more and more extraordinary every day," she said, "and not the least extraordinary thing about him is the way he affects other people. For my own part, I must confess that while I fear him, I like him. The Duke is frankly afraid of him. You are interested and repelled in turn, while Gertrude, I fancy, regards him as a sort of supernatural being, who may one day turn into a horse or a dog at a moment's notice. While Signor Galaghetti, with whom I had a short conversation today concerning him, was so enthusiastic in his praises that for once words failed him. He had never met anyone so wonderful, he declared. He would lay down his life for him. It would appear that on one occasion, when Nikola was staying at the hotel, he cured Galaghetti's eldest child of diphtheria. The child was at the last gasp, and the doctors had given her up. When Nikola made his appearance upon the scene, what he did, or how he did it, Galaghetti did not tell me, but it must have been something decidedly irregular, for the other doctors were aghast and left the house in a body. The child, however, rallied from that moment, and, as Galaghetti proudly informed me, is now the artiste of great repute upon the pianoforte in Paris. I have never heard of her, but it would appear that Galaghetti not only attributes her life, but also her musical success, to the fact that Nikola was staying in the hotel at the time when the child was taken ill. The Duke was with me when Galaghetti told me this, and when he heard it he turned away with an exclamation that sounded very like humbug. I do hope that Dr. Nikola and the Duke won't quarrel." As she put this in the form of a question, I felt inclined to reply with the expression the Duke had used. I did not do so, however, but contented myself with assuring her that she need have no fears upon that score. A surprise, however, was in store for me. "What have they to quarrel about?" I asked. "They have nothing in common." "Only proves how blind you are to what goes on around you," my wife replied. "Have you not noticed that they both admire Gertrude Trevor?" Falling so pat upon my own thoughts, this gave me food for serious reflection. "Do you know that Nikola admires her?" I asked, a little sharply, I fear, for when one has uncomfortable suspicions one is not always best placed to find that another shares them. A double suspicion might be described as almost amounting to a certainty. "I am confident of it," she replied. "Did you not notice his manner towards her on the night of the excursion? It was most marked." "My dear girl," I said irritably, "if you are going to begin this sort of thing, you don't know where you will find yourself in the end. Nikola has been a wanderer all his life. He has met people of every nationality, of every rank and description. It is scarcely probable, charming though I am prepared to admit she is, that he would be affected by our friend. Besides, I had it from his own lips this morning that he will never marry." "You may be just as certain as you please," she answered. Nevertheless, I adhered to my opinion. Knowing what was in my own mind, and feeling that if the argument continued I might let something slip that I should regret, I withdrew from the field, and having questioned her concerning certain news she had received from England that day, bade her good night. The next morning we paid a visit to the Palace of the Doges, and spent a pleasant and instructive couple of hours in the various rooms. Whatever Nikola's feelings may have been, there was by this time not the least doubt that the Duke admired Miss Trevor. Though the lad had known her for so short a time, he was already head over ears in love. I think Gertrude was aware of the fact, and I feel sure that she liked him, but whether the time was not yet ripe, or her feminine instinct warned her to play her fish for a while before attempting to land him, I cannot say. At any rate, she more than once availed herself of an opportunity and moved away from him to take her place at my side. As you may suppose, Glenbarth was not rendered any the happier by these manoeuvres. Indeed, by the time we left the palace, he was as miserable as a human being as could have been found in all of Venice. Before lunch, however, she relented a little toward him, and when we sat down to the meal in question, our friend had in some measure recovered his former spirits. Not so my wife, however. Though I did not guess it, I was in for a wigging. "How come you treat the poor fellow so badly?" she said indignantly, when we were alone together afterwards. "If you're not very careful, you'll spoil everything." "Spoil what?" I inquired, as if I did not understand to what she alluded. "You have lately developed a habit of speaking in riddles." "Fiddle-de-dee," she answered scornfully. "You know very well to what I allude. I think your conduct at the palace this morning was disgraceful. You, a married man and a father, try and spoil the pleasure of that poor young man." "She began it," I answered in self-defence. "Did you not see that she preferred my company to his?" "Of course that was only make-believe," my wife replied. "You are as well aware of that as I am." "I know nothing of the kind," I returned. "If the girl does not know her own mind, then it is safer that she should pretend as she did to day." "She was not pretending. You know that Gertrude Trevor is as honest as the day." "Then you admit that she was only playing her fish," I said. "If you are going to be vulgar I shall leave you," she retorted. "I don't know what you mean by playing her fish. Gertrude only came to you because she did not want to allow her liking for the Duke to appear too conspicuous." "It's the same thing in the end," I answered. "Believe me, it is. You describe it as not making her conduct appear too conspicuous, while I call it playing her fish. I have the best possible recollection of a young lady who used to play quoits with me on the deck of the Orotava a good many years ago. One day we were approaching Naples. At the time she played game after game with the doctor and snubbed me unmercifully." "You know very well I didn't mean it," she answered with a stamp of her foot. "You know I had to act as I did." "I don't mind admitting that," I replied. "Nevertheless, you were playing your fish. That night after dinner you forgave me, and—" She slipped her arm through mine and gave it a hug. I could afford to be generous. Those were the dear old days, were they not? For one, I am not going to quarrel about them. Now let's go and find the others. We discovered them in the balcony, listening to some musicians on a gondola below. Miss Trevor plainly hailed our coming with delight. The Duke, however, was by no means so well pleased. He did his best, however, to conceal his chagrin. Going to the edge of the balcony, I looked down at the boat. The musicians were 4 in number, 2 men and 2 girls. And at the moment of our putting in an appearance, one of them was singing the Ave Maria from the Cavalleria Rusticana in a manner that I had seldom heard it sung before. She was a handsome girl, and knew the value of her good looks. Beside her stood a man with a guitar, and I gave a start as I looked at him. Did my eyes deceive me? Or was this the man who had accompanied the police agent to Nikola's residence on the previous evening? I looked again, and I felt that I could not be mistaken. He possessed the same bullet head, the close cropped hair, the same clean shaven face, the same peculiarly square shoulders. No, I felt sure that he was the man, but if so, what was he doing here under our windows? One thing was quite apparent. If he recognized me, he did not give me evidence of the fact. He played and looked up at us without the slightest sign of recognition. To all intents and purposes, he was the picture of indifference. While they were performing, I recalled the scene of the previous night, and wondered what had become of the police officer, and what the man below me had thought of the curious trick Nikola had performed. It was only when they had finished their entertainment, and having received our reward, were about to move away, that I received any information to the effect that the man had recognized me. "Illustrious Senora, Senorita, and Senors, I thank you," he said politely, lifting his hat as he spoke. "Our performance has been successful, and the obstacle which threatened it at one time has been removed." The gondola then passed on. I turned to the Duke as if for an explanation. "At first the hall porter was not inclined to let them sing here," the Duke remarked, "but Miss Trevor wanted to hear them, so I sent word down that I wished them to remain." In spite of the explanation, I understood to what the man had referred, but for the life of me could not arrive at his reason for visiting our hotel that day. I argued that it might have been all a matter of chance, but I soon put that idea aside as absurd. The coincidence was too remarkable. At lunch my wife announced that she had heard that morning that Lady Beltringham the wife of our neighbour in the forest, was in Venice, and staying at a certain hotel further along the Grand Canal. Gertrude and I are going to call upon her this afternoon, she said, so that you two gentlemen must amuse yourselves as best you can without us. That is very easily done, I answered. The Duke is going to have his hair cut, and I'm going to witness the atrocity. You may expect to see him return, not unlike that man with the guitar in the boat this morning. By the way, said Glenbarth, that reminds me, I was going to point out a curious thing to you concerning that man. Did you notice, Miss Trevor, that when we were alone together in the balcony he did not once touch his instrument, but directly Hatteras and Lady Hatteras arrived, he jumped up and began to play? This confirmed my suspicions. I had quite come to the conclusion by this time that the man had only made his appearance before the hotel in order to be certain of my address. Yet I had to ask myself, if he were in Nikola's employ, why should he have to be anxious to do so? An hour later the ladies departed on their polite errand, and the Duke and I were left together. He was not what I should call a good companion. He was in an irritable mood. Nothing I could do or say seemed to comfort him. I knew very well what was the matter, and when we had exhausted English politics and the rise and fall of Venice, Ruskin, and the advantages of foreign travel, I mentioned incidentally the name of Miss Trevor. The frown vanished from his face, and he answered like a coherent mortal. Look here, Hatteras, he said with a fine burst of confidence, you and I have been friends for a good many years, and I think we know each other about as well as two men can do. That is so, I answered, wondering what he was driving at. We've been through some strange adventures together, and should certainly know each other. I hope that you are not going to propose that we should depart on some harum-scarum expedition like that you wanted me to join you in last year, to the Pamirs, was it not? If so, I can tell you once and for all that my lady won't hear of it. Confound the Pamirs, he replied angrily. Is it likely that I should think of going there just now? You misunderstand my meaning entirely. What I want is a sympathetic friend who can enter into my troubles and, if possible, help me out of them. For the life of me I could not forbear from teasing him for a little longer. My dear old fellow, I said, you know that I will do anything I possibly can to help you. Take my advice and get rid of the man at once. As I told you in my letter to you before you left England, it is only misplaced kindness to keep him on. You know very well that he has been unfaithful to you for some years past. Then why allow him to continue in his wrongdoing? The smash will come sooner or later. What do you mean? He asked. Well, I suppose your trouble is connected with the agent you were telling me of yesterday. The man who, it was discovered, had been cooking the accounts, selling your game, pocketing the proceeds, and generally feathering his own nest at your expense. An ominous frown gathered upon my friend's forehead. Upon my word, he said, I really believe you're taking leave of your senses. Do you think I'm bothering myself at such a time about that wretched Mitchell? Let him sell every beast upon the farms, every head of game. And in point of fact, let him swindle me as he likes, and I wouldn't give a second thought to him. I'm very sorry, I answered penitently, rolling the leaf of my cigar. Then it was the yacht you were thinking about. You have what I consider a very good offer for it. Let her go. You're rich enough to be able to build another, and the work will amuse you. You want employment of some sort. I'm not thinking of the yacht either, he growled. You know that as well as I do. How should I know it? I answered. I'm not able to tell you what is in your mind. I do not happen to be like Nikola. You are singularly obtuse today, he asserted, throwing what remains of his cigar in the canal and taking another from his case. Look here, I said, you're pitching into me because I can't appreciate your position. Now, how am I likely to be able to do so, considering that you've told me nothing about it? Before we left London, you informed me that the place you had purchased in Warwickshire was going to prove your chief worry in life. I said, sell it again. Then you found that your agent in Yorkshire was not what he might be. I advised you to get rid of him. You would not do so because of his family. Then you confessed in a most lugubrious fashion that your yacht was practically becoming unseaworthy by reason of her age. I suggested that you should sell her to Deeside, who likes her, or part with her for a junk. You vowed you would not do so because she was a favourite. Now you're unhappy, and I naturally suppose that it must be one of these things which is causing you uneasiness. You scout the idea. What, therefore, am I to believe? Upon my word, my friend, if I did not remember that you have always declared your abhorrence of the sex, I should begin to think you must be in love." He looked at me out of the corner of his eye. I pretended not to notice it, however, and still rolled the leaf of my cigar. "Would it be such a very mad thing if I did fall in love?" he asked at last. "My father did so before me, and I believe my grandfather did also. You yourself committed the same indiscretion. And have you seen the miserable result?" "I have observed one of the happiest couples in the world," he replied. "But joking apart, Hatteras, I want to talk the matter over with you seriously. I don't mind telling you at once that as between friend and friend, that I want to marry Miss Trevor." I endeavoured to look surprised, but I fear the attempt was a failure. "May I remind you," I said, "you have only known her barely a week. I don't want to discourage you, but is not your affection of rather quick growth?" "It is, but it does not mean that I am not the less sincere. I tell you candidly, Dick, I have never seen such a girl in my life. She would make any man happy." "Very likely, but would any man make her happy?" His face fell and he shifted uneasily in his chair. "Confound you," he said. "You put everything in a new light. Why should I not be able to make her happy? There are lots of women who would give their lives to be a duchess." "I admit that," I answered. "I don't fancy, however, your rank will make much difference with Miss Trevor. When a woman is a lady and in love, she doesn't mind very much whether the object of her affections is a duke or a chimney sweep. Don't make the mistake of believing that a dukedom counts for everything where the heart is concerned. We outsiders should have no chance at all if that were the case." "But Hatteras," he said, "I didn't mean that. I'm not such a cad as to imagine that Miss Trevor would marry me simply because I happen to have a handle to my name. I want to put the matter plainly before you. I told you that I love her. Do you think there's any chance of her taking a liking to me?" "Now that you have told me what is in your mind," I answered, "I can safely state my opinion. Mind you, I know nothing about the young lady's ideas, but if I were a young woman and an exceedingly presentable young man, you may thank me for the compliment afterwards, were to lay his heart at my feet, especially when that heart is served up on strawberry leaves and £5 notes, I fancy I should be inclined to think twice before I discouraged his advances. Whether Miss Trevor will do so, however, is quite another matter." "Then you are not able to give me any encouragement?" "I will wish you Godspeed upon your enterprise," I said. "If that is any satisfaction to you, I cannot do more." As I said it, I held up my hand, which he took and shook. "God bless you, old man," he said. "You don't know what all this means to me. I've suffered agonies these last 2 days. I believe I should go mad if it continued. Yesterday she was kindness itself. To day she will scarcely speak to me. I believe Lady Hatteras takes my side." I was not to be caught napping. "You must remember that Lady Hatteras herself is an impressionable young woman," I answered. "She likes you and believes in you, and because she does, she thinks her friend ought to do so also. Now look here, your Grace." "You needn't put on any sign of that kind," he answered reproachfully. "I believe I'm talking to the Duke of Glenbarth," I returned. "You are talking to your old friend, the man who went round the world with you, if that's what you mean," he answered. "What does he have to say?" "I want you to plainly understand that Miss Trevor is my guest. I want you also to realize, however difficult it may be, that you have only known her a very short time. She is a particularly nice girl, as you yourself have admitted. It would be scarcely fair, therefore, if I were to permit you to give her the impression that you were in love with her until you have really made up your mind. Think it well over. Take another week, shall we say a fortnight? A month would be better still." He groaned in despair. "You might as well say a year while you are about it. What is the use of my waiting even a week when I know my own mind already?" "Because you must give your affection time to set. Take a week. At the end of that time you are still as much in earnest as you are now, well, the matter will be worth thinking about. Then you can speak to the young lady or not as you please. On the other hand, should your opinion have changed, then I have been your only confidant and no harm has been done. If she accepts you, I can honestly say that no one will be more delighted than myself. If not, you must look elsewhere, and then she must marry the man she likes better. Do you agree?" "As I can't help myself, I suppose I must," he answered. "But my position during the next week is not likely to be a very cheerful one." "I don't see at all why," I replied. "Lots of others have been compelled to do their courting under harder auspices. Myself, for instance. Here you are, staying in the same house as the object of your affections. You meet her almost every hour of the day. You have innumerable opportunities of paying your court to her, and yet with all these advantages you abuse your lot." "I know I'm an ungrateful beast," he said. "By Jove, Dick, when one is as much in love as I am with the most adorable woman in the world, and matters don't seem to go right, one ought to be excused if one feels inclined to quarrel with somebody." "Quarrel away with all your heart," I answered. "And now I'm going down with you to the hairdresser. After that we'll go to the piazza." "I suppose I must," he said, rising from his chair with a fine air of resignation. "And what fun you can discover in that crowd I cannot for the life of me imagine." I did not remind him that on the previous afternoon he had declared it to be the most amusing sight in Europe. That would have been an unfair advantage to have taken, particularly as I had punished him enough already. We accordingly procured our hats and sticks, and having secured a gondola, set off. It was a lovely afternoon, and the Grand Canal was crowded. As we passed the entrance to the Rio del Consiglio, I stole a glance at the Palace Revecce. No gondola was at the door, so whether Nikola was at home or abroad I could not say. When Glenbarth had been operated upon, we proceeded to the Piazza of St. Mark, which we reached somewhat before the usual afternoon promenade. The band had not commenced to play, and the idlers were few in number. Having engaged 2 chairs at one of the tables, we sat down and ordered coffee. The Duke was plainly ill at ease. He fretted and fidgeted continually. His eyes scarcely wandered from the steps of the lagoon, and every gondola that drew up received his scrutinising attention. When at last 2 ladies disembarked and made their way across the stones towards Florian's Café, where we were seated, I thought he would have made an exhibition of himself. Lady Beltringham, it would seem, had arrived, but was so fatigued by a long journey that she was unable to receive visitors. "We returned almost immediately to the hotel," my wife said reproachfully. "We thought you would have waited for us there." Glenbarth looked at me as nothing I could ever do would make up for the enormity of my offence. He then described to Miss Trevor some wonderful photographs he had discovered that morning in a certain shop on the other side of the piazza. She questioned him concerning them, and I suggested they should go off and overhaul them. This they did, and when they had departed my wife produced some letters for me she had taken from the rack at the hotel. I looked at the writing on the envelope of the first, but for a moment could not recall where or when I had seen it before. Then I opened it and withdrew the contents. "Why, it's from George Anstruther," I exclaimed when I examined the signature. "He's in Algiers." "What's the letter about?" my wife inquired. "You've not heard from him for so long." "I'll read it," I said, and began as follows. "My dear Hatteras, here I am in the most charming place in the whole Mediterranean, and I ought to know, for I've seen and loathed all the others. My villa overlooks the sea, and my yacht rides at anchor in the bay. There are many nice people here, and not the least pleasant is my very good friend, Don José de Martinos, who is leaving today for his first visit to Venice via Nice, and I understand from him that he is to stay at your hotel. He is a delightful creature, and has seen much of the world, and if you will admit him to the circle of your acquaintance, I don't think you will regret it. I need not bore either myself or you by repeating the hackneyed phrases to the effect that any civility you show him will be considered a kindness to myself, etc., etc. Remember me most kindly to Lady Hatteras, and believe me to be, ever sincerely yours, George Anstruther." My wife uttered a little cry of vexation. "Pleasant though he may prove, I cannot help saying that I am sorry Don José Martinos is coming," she said. "Our little party of 4 was so happily arranged, and who knows but that a 5th may upset its peace altogether." "But he is Anstruther's friend," I said in expostulation. "One must be civil to one's friends." "I do not at all see why," she answered. "As we like Mr. Anstruther, it does not follow that we shall like his friend." At that moment the young couple were to be observed crossing the piazza in our direction. Glenbarth carried a parcel under his arm. "I don't think there's much doubt about that affair," said my wife, as she regarded them approvingly. "Don't be too sure," I answered. "There is many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, and there's another old saying to the effect that those who live longest see most. One is sometimes oracular, even in jest." End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Farewell, Nikola. by Guy Boothby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. On the following day, having sent my servant to inquire, I was informed that the Don José de Martinos had arrived at the hotel, and had engaged rooms on the floor above our own. Accordingly, after luncheon, I ascended to the rooms in question, and asked whether he would receive me. I had scarcely waited more than a minute before he made his appearance. He paused on the threshold to give an order to his man, and while he did so, I was permitted an opportunity of taking stock of him. He was a tall, muscular man of between 35 and 40 years of age. His appearance did not betray so much of his Spanish origin as I had expected. Indeed, it would have been difficult to have given him a nationality. I noticed that his beard, which he wore closely clipped, was not innocent of the touch of time. His face was a powerful one, but at first glance I was not altogether prepossessed in its favour. His hands and feet were small, the former particularly so for a man of his size and build. Moreover, he was faultlessly dressed, and carried himself with the air of a man of the world and of good breeding. "Sir Richard Hatteras," he said, and crossed the room to greet me. "This is kind of you indeed. My friend Anstruther informed me that you were in Venice, and was good enough to take upon himself the responsibility of introducing me to you." His voice was strong and musical, and he pronounced every word. He spoke excellent English, as if it had a value of its own. I inquired after Anstruther's health, which for some time past had been precarious, and it was with satisfaction that I learnt of the improvement that had taken place in it. "You would scarcely know him now," said Martinez. "He looks quite strong again. But permit me to offer you a cigar. We Spaniards say that we cannot talk unless we smoke. You English say that you cannot smoke if you talk." And as he said this, he handed me a box of cigars. "I fancy you will like them," he said. "The tobacco was grown upon my own estate in Cuba. For that reason I can guarantee their purity." The weed I selected was excellent. In fact, one of the best cigars I had ever smoked. While he was lighting his, I stole another glance at him. Decidedly he was a handsome man, but here was the stumbling block. I cannot say what about him that I did not altogether like. It was not a crafty face, far from it. The eyes were well placed, and the mouth, from what one could see of it under his black moustache, was well moulded, with white, even teeth. The nose was even slightly aquiline, and the chin large, firm, and square. Nevertheless, there was something about it that did not suit my fancy. Once I told myself it was a cruel face, yet the singularly winning smile that followed a remark of mine a moment later went some way towards disabusing my mind upon that point. "Lady Hatteras, I understood from Senor Anstruther, is with you," he said, after we had talked of other things. "She is downstairs at this moment," I answered. "We are a party of 4. Miss Trevor, the daughter of the Dean of Bedminster, the Duke of Glenbarth, my wife, and myself. I hope you will permit me the pleasure of introducing you to them at an early date." "I shall be most happy," he replied. "I am particularly fond of Venice, but when all is said and done one must have companions to enjoy it thoroughly." I had been given to understand that this was his first visit to the Queen of the Adriatic, but I did not comment upon the fact. One was inclined to believe that Adam would have enjoyed the Garden of Eden if it had not been for Eve, I remarked with a smile. "Poor Adam," he answered. "I have always thought him a much abused man. Unlike ourselves, he was without experience. He had a companion forced upon him who worked his ruin, and the loss on the transaction was not only physical but financial." "How long do you contemplate remaining in Venice?" I asked, after the little pause that followed his last speech. "I scarcely know," he answered. "My movements are most erratic. I am the most unfortunate of God's creatures. I wander the face of the earth. I have no relations and few friends. I roam about as the fancy takes me, remain in a place as long as it pleases me, and then, like the Arab in the poem, silently take up my tent and move on as soon as the city I happen to be in at the time has lost its charm. I possess a pied à terre of 4 rooms in Cairo. I have lived amongst the Kabyles in the desert, and with the Armenians in the mountains. To sum it up, I have the instincts of the wandering Jew, and fortunately the means of gratifying them." What it was I cannot say, but there was something in his speech that grated upon my feelings. whether what he had said was the true or not, I am not in a position to affirm, but the impression I received that he was talking for effect, and everyone will know what that means. "As you are such a globe-trotter," I said, "perhaps there is scarcely a portion of the world that you have not visited." "I have perhaps had more than my share of travelling," he answered. "I think I can safely say that with the exception of South America, I have visited every portion of the known globe." "You have never been in South America, then?" I asked in some surprise. "Never," he replied, and immediately changed the conversation by inquiring whether I had met certain of Anstruther's friends who were supposed to be on their way to Venice. A few minutes later, after having given him an invitation to dinner the next evening, I bade him good bye and left him. On my return my wife was eager to question me concerning him, but as things stood I did not feel capable of giving her a detailed reply. There are some acquaintances who one feels will prove friends from the outset. There are others who fill one from the first with a vague distrust. Not that I altogether distrusted Martinos. I had not seen enough of him to do that. At the same time, however, I could not conscientiously say, as I have already observed, that I was altogether prepossessed in his favour. The following morning he accepted my invitation for that evening, and punctually at 7:30 he made his appearance in the drawing-room. I introduced him to my wife and also to Miss Trevor when she joined us. "My husband tells me that you are a great traveller," said Phyllis after they had seated themselves. "He says you know the world as we know London." "Your husband does me too much honour," he answered modestly. "From what I have heard of you, you must know the world almost as well as I do. My friend Anstruther has told me a romantic story about you, something connected with the South Sea Island, and a mysterious personage named—" He paused for a moment as if to remember the name. "Nikola," I said. "You do not happen to have met him, I suppose?" "To my knowledge, never," he answered. "It is a strange surname." At that moment Glenbarth entered the room, and I introduced the two men to each other. For some reason of my own I was quite prepared to find that the Duke would not take a fancy to our new acquaintance. Nor was I destined to be disappointed. Before dinner was half over I could see that he had a great difficulty in being civil to the stranger. Had Martinus not been our guest, I doubt very much whether he would have been able to control himself. And yet the Spaniard laid himself out in every way to please. His attentions were paid chiefly to my wife. I do not believe that he addressed Miss Trevor more than a dozen times throughout the meal. Notwithstanding this fact, Glenbarth regarded him with evident animosity, insomuch that Miss Trevor more than once looked at him with an expression of positive alarm upon her face. She had not seen him in this humour before, and though she may have had her suspicions as to the reason of it, it was plain that she was far from approving of his line of action. When the ladies withdrew and the wine was being circulated, I endeavoured to draw the two men into greater harmony with each other. The attempt, however, was unsuccessful. More than once Glenbarth said things which bordered on rudeness, till I began to feel angry with him. On one occasion, happening to look up suddenly from the cigar which I was cutting, I detected a look upon the Spaniard's face that startled me. It, however, showed me one thing, and that was the fact that, despite his genial behaviour, Martinos had not been blind to the young man's treatment of himself, and also, should a time ever arrive when he would have a chance of doing Glenbarth a mischief, he would not be forgetful of the debt he owed him. Matters were not much better when we adjourned to the drawing-room. Glenbarth, according to custom, seated himself beside Miss Trevor, and studiously ignored the Spaniard. I was more than sorry for this, and I could say it was the behaviour of a schoolboy, not that of a man of the world. And the worst part of it was that it was doing Glenbarth no sort of good in the eyes of the person with whom he wished to stand best. The truth was the poor lad was far from being himself. He was suffering from an acute attack of a disease which has not yet received the proper attention of science, the disease of first love. So overwhelmed was he by his passion that he could not bear any stranger even to look upon the object of his adoration. Later in the evening matters reached their climax, when my wife asked the Don to sing. "I feel sure that you do sing," she said in an artless way which women often affect. "I sometimes try to amuse my friends," said he, and begging us to excuse him, he retired to his own rooms, to presently return with a large Spanish guitar. Having taken a seat near the window, and when he had swept his fingers over the strings in a few preliminary chords, he commenced to sing. He was the possessor of a rich baritone, which he used with excellent effect. My wife was delighted and asked him to sing again. Miss Trevor also expressed her delight and seconded my wife's proposal. This was altogether too much for Glenbarth. Muttering something about a severe headache, he hurriedly left the room. My wife and I exchanged glances, but Martinos and Miss Trevor did not appear to notice his absence. This time he sang a Spanish fishing song, but I did not pay much attention to it. A little later the Don, having thanked us for our hospitality, took his departure, and when Miss Trevor said good night to us and had retired to her own room, my wife and I were left alone together. "What could have made the Duke behave like that?" she said. "He's madly in love, my dear, and also madly jealous," I answered. "I hope and trust, however, that he's not going to repeat this performance." "If he does, it will imperil any chance of his winning Gertrude's love," she replied. "He will also place us in a decidedly awkward position." "Let this be a lesson to you, my dear, never to play with fire again," I replied. "You bring two inflammable people together, and wonder that there should be an explosion." "Well, I'm really very angry with him. I don't know what Don José must have thought." "Probably he thought nothing about it," I replied. "You mustn't be too angry with Glenbarth, however. Leave him to me, and I'll talk to him to morrow, I promise you. He'll be sorry for himself. If I know anything of women, Gertrude will make him wish he had acted differently." "I don't think she will bother about the matter. She has too much sense." "Very well, we shall see." Then I bade her go to bed, promising myself to sit up for Glenbarth, who I discovered had gone out. It was nearly midnight when he returned. I noticed that every trace of ill humour had vanished from his face, and he was quite himself once more. "My dear Dick," he said, "I don't know how to apologize for my ridiculous and rude behaviour of to-night. I am more ashamed of myself than I can say. I behaved like a child. Because he happened to be in a repentant mood, I was not going to let him off the chastising I felt I ought to give him." "A nice sort of fellow you are, upon my word," I said, putting down the paper I had been reading as I spoke. "I've a very good mind to tell you exactly what I think of you." "You'd only be wasting your time," he returned, "for you can't think half as badly of me as I do myself. I can't imagine what made me do it." "Can't you?" I said. "Well, I can. And as you are pretty certain to catch it in one particular quarter to morrow, I fancy on mature reflection that I can afford to forgive you. The man had done you no harm. He not only did not interfere with you, but he was not trespassing upon your—" "Don't speak of him," said the young fellow, flaring up at once. "If I think of him I shall get angry again. I can't bear the look of the beggar." "Steady, my young friend, steady," I returned. "You mustn't call other people's friends by that name." "He is not your friend," said Glenbarth excitedly. "You've never seen him until to night, and you've known me ever since I was about so high." "I began to imagine you were only so high this evening," I said. "It's a good thing for you that the wife has gone to bed, or I fancy you had heard something that would have made your ears tingle. After the foolish manner of women, she has come to the conclusion that she would like you to marry Miss Trevor." "God bless her," he said fervently. "I knew that she was my friend." "In that case you would probably have enjoyed a friend's privilege had you been here to night before she retired, and have received a dressing down that is usually reserved for her husband. I live in hopes that you may get it to morrow." "Bosh!" he answered. "And now, if you have forgiven me, I think I will go to bed. I've had enough of myself for one day." With that we shook hands and bade each other good night. At his bedroom door he stopped me. "Do you think she will forgive me?" he asked as humbly as a boy who had just been caught stealing sugar plums. "My wife," I answered, "yes, I think it very probable that she will." "No, no, how dense you are! I mean—" Here he nodded his head in the direction of the room occupied by Miss Trevor. "You'll have to find that out for yourself," I replied, and then went on to my dressing room. "That will give your Grace something to think about all night," I said as I took off my coat. As it turned out, I was destined to be fairly accurate in the prophecy I had made concerning Miss Trevor's treatment of Glenbarth on the morrow. At breakfast she did not altogether ignore him, but when I say she devoted the largest share of attention to myself, those of my readers who are married, and have probably had the same experience, will understand. My wife, on the other hand, was affability itself, and from her behaviour toward him appeared to be quite willing to forgive and forget the unfortunate episode of the previous evening. I chuckled to myself, but said nothing. He was not at the end of his punishment yet. All that day we saw nothing of Martinos. Whether he remained at home or went abroad, we could not say. On returning to the hotel to lunch, however, we discovered a basket of roses in the drawing-room, with the Don's card tied to the handle. "Oh, what lovely flowers!" cried my wife in an ecstasy. "Look, Gertrude, are they not beautiful?" Miss Trevor cordially admired them, and in order, I suppose, that Glenbarth's punishment might be the more complete, begged for a bud to wear herself. One was given to her, while I watched Glenbarth's face over the top of the letter I was reading at the moment. My heart was touched by his miserable face. When he and my wife had left the room to prepare for lunch, I determined to put in a good word for him. "Miss Gertrude," I said, "as an old friend I have a favour to ask of you. Do you think you can grant it?" "You must first tell me what it is," she said, with a smile upon her face. "I know from experience that you are not to be trusted." "A nice sort of character for a family man," I protested. "Lady Hatteras has been telling tales, I can see." "Your wife would never tell a tale of any one, particularly of you," she asserted. "But what would you ask of me?" "Only a plea for human happiness," I said with mock gravity. "I have seen the absolute despair written indelibly on a certain human countenance to day, and the sight has troubled me ever since. Are you aware that there is a poor young man in this hotel whose face opens like a daisy to the sun when you smile upon him, and closes in the darkness of your neglect?" "How absurd you are!" "Why am I absurd?" "Because you talk in this fashion. Will you smile upon him again? He has suffered a great deal these last 2 days." "Really, you are too ridiculous. I don't know what you mean." "That is not the truth, Miss Trevor, and you know it." "But what have I done wrong?" "The business with the rose just now, for instance, was cruel, to say the least of it." "Really, Sir Richard, you do say such foolish things. If I want a rose to wear, surely I may have one. But I must not stay talking to you. It's 25 minutes past 1. I must go and get ready for lunch." I held open the door for her, and as she passed I said, "You will do what I ask, just to please me?" "I don't know what you mean, but I will think it over," she replied, and then departed to her room. She must have done as she promised, for the rose was absent from her dress when she sat down to lunch. Glenbarth noticed it, and from that moment his drooping spirits revived. That afternoon my wife and I went down to meet the P&O mail boat, in order to discover some friends who were on their way to Egypt. As neither the Duke of Glenbarth nor Miss Trevor were acquainted with them, they were excused from attendance. When we joined them, it was plain that all traces of trouble had been removed, and in consequence the Duke was basking in the seventh heaven of happiness. Had I asked the young man at that moment for half his estates, I believe he would have willingly given them to me. He would have done so even more willingly had he known that it was to my agency that he owed the wondrous change in his affairs. For some reason of her own, Miss Trevor was also in the best of spirits. My wife was happy because her turtle doves were happy, and I beamed upon them all with the complacency of the god out of the machine. All this time I had been wondering as to the reason why we had not heard or seen anything of Nikola. Why I should have expected to do so I cannot say, but after the events of 3 evenings ago I had entertained a vague hope that I should have seen him, or that he would have communicated with me in some form or another. We were to see him, however, before very long. We had arranged to visit the Academy on our return from the mail boat, where my wife was anxious to renew her acquaintance with the Titians. For my own part, I am prepared to admit that my knowledge of the pictures is not sufficiently cultivated to enable me to derive any pleasure from the constant perusal of these masters. Phyllis and Miss Trevor, however, managed to discover a source of considerable satisfaction in them. When we left the gallery we made our way, according to custom, in the direction of the Piazza of St. Mark. We had not advanced very far upon our walk, however, before I chanced to turn round to discover, striding after us, no less a person than our new acquaintance, John José Martinos. He bowed to the ladies, shook hands with myself, and nodded to the Duke. "If you are proceeding in the direction of Piazza, will you permit me to accompany you?" he asked, and that permission having been given by my wife, we continued our walk. What Glenbarth thought of it I do not know, but as he had just Miss Trevor to himself, I do not see that he had anything to complain of. On reaching Florian's Café we took our customary seats, the Don placing himself next to my wife, and laying himself out to be agreeable. Once he addressed Glenbarth, and I was astonished to see the conciliatory manner that the other adopted towards him. "Now that he sees he has nothing to fear, perhaps he will not be so jealous," I said to myself, and indeed it appeared as if this were likely to be the case. I was more relieved by this discovery than I could say. As we should probably be some time in Venice, and the Don had arrived with the same intention, and we were to be located in the same hotel, it was of the utmost importance to our mutual comforts that there should be no friction between the two men. But enough of this subject for the present. There are other matters to be considered. In the first place, I must put on record a curious circumstance. In the light of after events it bears a strange significance, and he would be a courageous man who would dare say that he could explain it. It must be borne in mind, in the order that the importance of what I am now about to describe may be plainly understood, that Miss Trevor was seated facing me, that is to say, with her back towards the Cathedral of St. Mark. She was in the best of spirits, and at the moment was engaged in an animated discussion with my wife on the effect of ancient art upon her bête noire, the Cockney tourist. Suddenly, without any apparent reason, her face grew deathly pale, and she came to a sudden stop in the middle of a sentence. Fortunately no one noticed it but my wife and myself, and as she was herself again in a moment, we neither of us called attention to it. A moment later I glanced across the square, and to my amazement saw no less a person than Dr. Nikola approaching us. Was it possible that Miss Trevor, in some extraordinary manner, had become aware of his proximity to her? Or was it only one of those strange coincidences that are so difficult to explain away? I did not know what to think then, nor, as a matter of fact, do I now. Reaching our party, Nikola raised his hat to the ladies. "I fear, Lady Hatteras," he said, "that I must have incurred your displeasure for keeping your husband so long away from you the other night. If so, I hope you will forgive me." "I will endeavour to do so," said my wife with a smile. "But you must be very careful how you offend again." Turning to Miss Trevor, he said, "I hope you will grant me your gracious intercession, Miss Trevor." "I will do my best for you," she answered, with a seriousness that made my wife and I look at her. And then Nikola shook hands with Glenbarth and glanced at the Don. "Permit me to introduce you to Don José de Martinos, Dr. Nikola," I said. "He has lately arrived from Algiers." The two men bowed gravely to each other. "You are fond of travelling, I presume, Senor?" said Nikola, fixing his eyes upon the Don. "I have seen a considerable portion of the world," the other answered. "I have seen the midnight sun at Cape North and the drift ice off the Horn." "And have not found it all barren," Nikola remarked gravely. From that moment the conversation flowed smoothly. Miss Trevor had quite recovered herself. I could see that the Don was intensely interested in Nikola, and indeed on this particular occasion the latter exerted himself to the utmost to please. I will admit, however, that something not unlike a shudder passed over me as I contrasted his present affability with his manner when he had threatened the unfortunate police agent a few nights before. Now he was a suave, pleasant-mannered man of the world. Then he figured almost as an avenging angel. Now he discussed modern literature, and then I had heard him threaten a human being with the direst penalties that it was possible for a man to inflict. When it was time for us to return to our hotel, Nikola rose and bade us good-bye. "I hope you will permit me the pleasure of seeing more of you while you are in Venice," said Nikola, addressing the Don. "If you are an admirer of the old palaces of this wonderful city, and our friends will accompany you, I shall be delighted to show you my own poor abode. It possesses points of interest that many of the other places lack, and though it has fallen somewhat into decay, I fancy you will admit that the fact does not altogether detract from its interest." "I shall hasten to avail myself of the opportunity you are kind enough to offer me," the other replied, after which they bowed ceremoniously to each other and parted. "Your friend is an extraordinary man," said the Don, as we walked towards the steps. "I have never met a more interesting person. Does he altogether reside in Venice?" "Oh dear, no," I replied. "If one were asked to say where Nikola had his abode, it would be almost necessary to say in the world. I myself first met him in London, afterwards in Egypt, then in Australia, and later on the South Sea Islands. Now we are together again in Venice. I have good reason for knowing that he is also familiar with China and Thibet. He himself confesses to a knowledge of Africa and Central America." "Central America," said the Don quickly. "Pray, what part of Central America does he know?" "That I am unable to say," I replied. "I have never questioned him upon the subject." From that moment the Don almost exclusively addressed himself to my wife, and did not refer to Nikola again. We parted in the hall of the hotel. Next morning we saw him for a few moments at the post office, but at no other time during the day. On the following day he accompanied us on an excursion to Chioggia, and dined with us afterwards. Though I knew that Glenbarth still disliked him, his hostility was so veiled as to be scarcely noticeable. Towards the end of the evening a note was brought to me. One glance at the handwriting upon the envelope was sufficient to show me that it was from Nikola. It ran as follows: "My dear Hatteras, remembering your friend Don Martino's desire to see my poor palace, I have written to ask him if he will dine with me to-morrow evening at 8 o'clock. If I can persuade you and the Duke of Glenbarth to give me the pleasure of your society, I need scarcely say that you will be adding to my delight. Sincerely yours, Nikola." "You have not, of course, received your letter yet," I said, addressing the Don. "What do you say to the invitation?" "I shall accept only too willingly," he answered without delay, "provided, of course, you will go too." "Have you any objection to raise, Duke?" I asked, addressing Glenbarth. I could see that he was not very anxious to go, but under the circumstances he could not very well refuse. "I shall be very happy," he answered, and for once in his life he deliberately said what he knew to be untrue. Chapter 7